Good afternoon. Welcome to Trail Talk. I'm really glad you could join me today. Kind of excited about this history lesson. I've been doing some deep dives, and if you know me, that's not a surprise at all. But I was a little inspired after the lesson about the Choctaw Code Talkers in World War One that we covered last week, and I started, digging around and found that actually the native, the first Americans, I'm going to call them the first Americans, just because, especially the wars that we're going to be talking about today, I feel like that is the best name or the best way to refer to them, to the first Americans, aka Native Americans, who, the people who inhabited the United States of America before the colonists came. And that's kind of the war that we're going to start with, the Revolutionary War. I know that there was a French and Indian War, but we're talking about the US. And so I'll probably do the French and Indian War another time. But we're gonna start off with talking about the Revolutionary War. Now, the Revolutionary War found Native Americans in a bit of a quandary. There were many who believed, I just said I was going to call them first Americans, and I said Native Americans. I will probably go back and forth. At any rate, some felt as though staying neutral, staying out of the war altogether would be their best option, because it was a war between the colonists and Great Britain. They felt like maybe they shouldn't be involved in it. There were others who felt like the colonists are the people who live here. They're the ones who are going to be living here. We should probably fight on their side and try to establish and maintain a friendly relationship. There were others who stood with the British. They thought that they could be more trusted than the colonists. The colonists were the ones who were coming in and taking land. They were literally the people who were coming and taking land. And so they felt more of an allegiance to the British, especially because there was something that was called the Proclamation of 1763 that was passed by the British Parliament, that said it reserved all the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains for these first Americans. And the colonists resented that. They wanted to be able to move and go and live wherever they wanted. They were on a great adventure, and they were finding a new home, and they were fleeing British control and persecution. There was religious persecution. There were a lot of things going on in Great Britain, besides the fact that it was just small. It's a tiny country, and they were looking for a place where they could be landowners and be farmers and be successful business people. And so there was a lot of that spirit in these colonists, and so they were coming here to live. When the Declaration of Independence was signed, July 4th, 1776, one of the charges that was levied against King George in the Declaration was that he had endeavored to prevent the population of the states. And that was a specific reference to the Proclamation of 1763, because he was trying to make a place where the Native Americans could live and maintain their lifestyle, and allow the colonists a place to live as well. The British also didn't see the skirmishes happening between the colonists and the Native Americans as a good thing either. And so they were trying to stop that from happening. But as we know, the Revolutionary War pounded on, and there were many people who ended up choosing sides. One community that was in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, sent 17 men to join an army of militiamen that was laying siege to Boston in 1775, early days of the Revolutionary War. Others joined the British and fought to defeat the American invasion of Canada that was happening about the same time. So these communities didn't always make unanimous decisions. Now, when we studied about the chiefs of the Plains tribes, we learned that, within each tribe, there were also different bands of people that formed these communities, and each of those bands might have their own chief. And some chiefs were medicine chiefs, they were war chiefs, they were decision-making chiefs. And so that it was that miscommunication probably started as far back as the Revolutionary War, of these European settlers assuming, oh, you call yourself a chief, you must be the guy that we need to talk to, when he could not, that particular chief could not really speak for everyone, every Native American, let alone even the ones within his tribe. He could only speak for the small group that where he lived. So all of this miscommunication and everything, of course, has led to, as we know, all of this situations with treaties and different things like that. But so making a unanimous decision was not going to happen. The Cherokee Nation actually was split between a faction that supported the colonists and the other, the British. The Iroquois Confederacy was actually 6 Native American nations in New York. It was also divided by the Revolutionary War. The Oneida and the Tuscarora chose to side with the Americans. Others, including the Mohawk, fought with the British. And as a result of that, this Iroquois Confederacy, which represented hundreds of years of coexistence and cooperation among these 6 nations, that came to an end because of the Revolutionary War. Kind of makes you think of the Civil War, doesn't it? Where families were divided based on their loyalties to the North or the South. So anyway, most of the fighting was between the warriors, the Native American warriors, American loyalists, and the rebel militia. But the war did not end when Cornwallis surrendered in Yorktown in 1781. The war east of the Appalachians came to an end, but the war on the frontiers became even more intense, with 1782 becoming known as the Bloody Year. Now, I don't know more about that, but I think that would be very interesting to kind of do a deep dive in that particular year and find out what all exactly happened. So the Revolutionary War, yes, it cost Great Britain these 13 colonies. It cost them control of what would later become the United States, but the Native Americans lost even more. They did not have there was a peace treaty, and in addition to recognizing the independence of the United States, the British ceded all British territory east of the Mississippi and south of Canada. So that whole area became part of the United States. But that decision had no input from the Native Americans who lived there. And most of them had chosen to fight for the British for that very reason. That it's as though they saw the writing on the wall, so to speak. They could see what was coming. And the fact that the colonists now had access to all of that land meant their time was probably limited on how much access they would be able to keep in all of that land. And so, of course, settlers flooded the new territory, harsh treatment, and, forcing the Native Americans to move out of certain areas, to congregate, to live in a much more, I guess, just a smaller area. You know, they became confined to certain areas. I wouldn't say that they necessarily had reservations set up yet in those days. I don't know that for sure, but I mean, it stands to reason. Very few of these early settlers are going to feel comfortable moving into an area where Native Americans might just live anywhere and not, you know, they not be aware of it. And so they wanted to feel safe. And by that, I don't mean that the Native Americans were that just out to attack and hurt the colonists. Of course, they were trying to protect what was theirs. This dilemma, this struggle, I mean, it started, and it's real, and it's a really big part of our history. So thus ended the Revolutionary War. The settling began, and you know that there had to have been a constant series of skirmishes happening. I actually began thinking about all of this and just wondering to myself, how many years without bloodshed were there here in the US? You know, I mean, we think, oh, the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, these little wars here and there, the Civil War. But how many years was there no bloodshed? Was there no fighting amongst the colonists and the Native Americans? I mean, it had to have been an ongoing situation, just a constant thing, you know, pushing and fighting and fighting back and claiming land and fighting for their land, for their lives, for their way of life, for their culture. I mean, man, there's a lot to it. So now we're going to move on to the War of 1812. So most Native Americans sided with Britain in the War of 1812 because they were, again, trying to safeguard their tribal lands. And they hoped that a British victory would kind of relieve some of this unrelenting pressure that these settlers were making. And they wanted to push further into southern Canada and the lower Great Lakes. All right. The settlers were trying to do that. So the tribes tried to remain neutral. Some supported the US, but most supported Britain. I mean, I think they really felt like they had an ally there because the British were against the colonists, in essence. They were trying to hold them back. Canada, I'm guessing Canada was at that time, it must have been it must have belonged to the British already by then. I know the part of Canada belonged to the French as well, but it must have just been this particular area. It brought the British over here to fight again. So Native Americans became involved because they were trying to have an ally in their own really personal war against the United States. And there was one man named Tecumseh. I'm sure you've heard his name mentioned in history. And I was familiar with his name, wasn't as familiar with his story until I was really studying this. So he was able to form essentially a first American coalition. He was able to bring people of different tribes, different cultures together to stand as one and fight with the British against these colonists. And it was an all-out effort to save their land. The outcome of the War of 1812 was nothing short of a catastrophe. They were never again able to find an external ally or threaten in any way to roll back the taking of the frontier by the Americans. It was kind of their last ditch effort. And Tecumseh was taken down in a battle. And he's quoted as saying, "Here is a chance presented to us. Yes, such as will never occur again for us Indians of North America to form ourselves into one great combination and cast our lot with the British in this war." He held nothing back. He knew that it was all or nothing, I guess you could say, for the Native Americans. And this was, like I said, this War of 1812, this was happening up in the north part of the U.S. around the Great Lakes area. The U.S. was trying to push up into Canada and acquire land up there. Well, during the same time, there was a separate war breaking out in the southern part of the United States. This happened during the summer of 1813. No, we're talking about the War of 1812. Okay. Unlike in the northern part of the U.S. where these tribes came together, the encroachment of these settlers into the South split the Creek tribe into two factions. And the militant side, the ones who were wanting to stand up and fight, they became known as the Red Sticks. And they were known amongst all of those tribes. The Creek they're a part of the Mississippian tribal group that became the 5 civilized tribes once they were relocated to Indian Territory. And the Red Sticks carried on this tradition of fighting for a long time. But they attacked Fort Mims, which is near Mobile, Alabama, and massacred, I guess, the whole garrison on August the 30th of 1813. So there was a quick response for Tennessee, Georgia, and Mississippi Territory. And in November, the Tennessee militia under Andrew Jackson, this is probably where he really decided that he was going to do everything in his power to change the lives of the settlers and the Native Americans. He attacked the 2 Red Stick towns there in Alabama, the Alabama area. And these victories helped solidify support from the friendly Creeks, the ones who were not part of the Red Sticks. And they just kept attacking these towns where the Red Stick communities were. Friendly Creeks and Cherokees allied with the U.S. and accompanied Jackson's army in 1814. And there was a town known as Horseshoe Bend, and I guess there was a big battle there. It lasted a whole day, broke the Red Stick contingent, and many fled for safety to Spanish Florida. And at the Treaty of Fort Jackson negotiated that summer, the Creeks surrendered 23 million acres of land. So Wallace Moore, friend of the Chisholm Trail Heritage Center, he's a historical reenactor. He has several characters that he does, and he considers himself, his family is tied to the Creek Nation. Okay, when they were relocated from the southeast part of the U.S., his family came with them. They were part of the African-American people who lived among the Creeks. And the Creeks did not take the African-Americans and use them as slaves. They were more of a friendly, here, you are welcome to live amongst us kind of situation. So he had told me about these 2 factions and about the group that split off and ended up in Florida. And so it was kind of interesting to get the backside of that story and kind of how that all came to be. Anyway, in the end of the War of 1812, Jackson goes in the Battle of New Orleans in 1815. And the irony of the whole thing about the War of 1812 is it didn't matter if the Native Americans fought for the US or the British. In the end, they still lost their land. I mean, by the 1830s, all of those southeastern peoples were being moved, relocated. The Trail of Tears, the relocation, forced removal from their lands to what became known as Indian Territory and eventually Oklahoma. So it seems just so futile, doesn't it, to think about the fighting, the desire to just hang on to something that is familiar, something that has been a part of their lives forever. And their culture is built around the lands where they lived. So their way of life was affected or came to be based on the type of land, the geography of where they lived. And so that's why they lived as they did. That's why their culture has the history and the stories that explain everything about where they lived. And then they are moved to Indian Territory, and those stories don't relate to the children being born here because it's a different place and everything is different. It's a lot. It's a lot when you really stop and ponder and think about all of that. So the third war that we're going to discuss today is the Mexican-American War. This was so interesting to me, how Native Americans really played a big role in this war. So, the war between the U.S. and Mexico was really being waged over the part of that's called Texas. It was over Texas. Texas became a state in 1845, December of 1845. And that tension with the Mexican government, they never recognized Texas's independence. Texas was an independent nation before they joined the United States. They never recognized any of the steps that brought them from being a Mexican territory to becoming a state in the U.S. But after a clash that was led by Zachary Taylor and the Mexican troops in the disputed area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, Congress declared war on Mexico. This was in May 13th, 1846. And James K. Polk, who was the president at that time, called up 50,000 volunteers to join the existing U.S. Army. So what kind of led to this? So we're in the mid-1840s now. There had been treaties signed by the Comanches, Kiowas, Apaches, and Navajos with Mexico. They were living in that what we would call now West Texas, New Mexico area. And that was their homeland. Okay. And so they had treaties with Mexico. Mexico had come up and was like, hey, we want some of this land too. This is ours now. And so they are making treaties with the Native Americans, much like the U.S. had made treaties with the Native Americans, as they were moving westward from the East Coast. And in the early 1830s, those Comanche, Kiowa, Apache, and Navajo broke those treaties and began attacking Mexican communities, towns. And men from these communities were killing, they were capturing people, stealing or destroying their animals. When they were able to fight back, the Mexicans would, but and they would do the very same thing to these first Americans. The conflicts escalated through the 1830s and 40s until much of the northern third of Mexico was just a place of terror. Nobody wanted to cross that land. I'm sure, like in the story of Bud and Temple Abernathy, there was an area called the Badlands. I mean, it was just a small stretch of New Mexico into West Texas, but it was still inhabited by these, some of these people from these tribes in those days. And these were in the early 1900s, 1909. So that, you know, it was like this historically just place of that there was a constant risk for your life. You were never going to be safe going through there. And so settlers knew to try to avoid that when they were moving westward. The U.S. invasion claimed thousands of Mexican and Indian lives, scarred tens of thousands more, ruined critical sectors of northern Mexico's economy, and stalled its demographic growth, and depopulated much of its countryside, turning once thriving settlements into these deserts areas. It was just deserted. So isn't that interesting that Mexico, at least 1/3 of northern Mexico, probably even a greater amount if you really look at the map. I guess it does extend kind of a lot further south, but anyway, 1/3 of Mexico is first attacked by the Native Americans. The Mexicans, they fight back and forth, and the U.S. decides to come in and take advantage essentially of this dire situation. And so one story I read was that U.S. troops came into this village that had just been wiped out almost completely by a band of Native Americans. And even though they were there to remove the Mexicans, they were so moved at two different uses there, but they were just filled with compassion for them. And so they gave them what they needed to survive and helped them, and went after the Native Americans to try to get back the things that had been stolen from them. So it was kind of a situation that was not entirely along the lines of how this was supposed to be fought. But at any rate, I got so caught up in my stories, I forgot to show you the rest of these slides. Let's take a break for just a second. Negotiations going on between the British and the Native Americans, the War of 1812, just the Native Americans fighting all they had with all they have to try to defend their lands. Tecumseh, just a very, very famous man, taken down early in his life. So here we are at the Mexican-American War. I really wanted to show you this slide because this is an actual photograph that was taken back in those days. I just thought it was fascinating that there was an actual photograph from the 1840s, probably at the very latest. So these deserted towns, kind of ghost towns, are popping up everywhere. And the Mexican citizens were asking themselves all kinds of questions. You know, what do we owe the local, state, national governments? What do we owe each other? All these disagreements, it seemed that there was causing a lot of dissension among the people of Mexico. And so they just began to leave. Now, James K. Polk was very much a man about manifest destiny. Okay, that was his thing. And so they were ready. They readied the troops to go into this northern Mexico territory and just take the land. They would come on these homes and villages, and this was the mindset. Americans thought that it was absolutely ridiculous that the Mexicans were willing to just give up and let the land go back to the Native Americans who had been there since the beginning of time, right? And the Americans saw this as an opportunity because they thought they could do it better. They thought that they felt like they would not give up, and they'd had a lot of success. I mean, we're talking from the East Coast, they had made their way all the way to, I mean, West Texas, New Mexico, right? All the while taking land from the Native Americans, moving the Native Americans, forcing them into Indian territory. I mean, this was a real deal. And so, of course, they had a lot of confidence. In the 1830s and 1840s, editors, diplomats, congressmen, and administration officials invoked Mexico's manifest inability to control Indians, first in Texas and later across the whole of the Mexican North. And those attitudes reached in 1846 and 1847, when the U.S. invaded Mexico. It was just, this is probably a great depiction of, it was just an all-out battle. As far as the eye can see in this painting, it's gunfire, and it's just man against man and nation against nation. The U.S. coming to take the land that the Mexico had essentially deserted and left behind. Finally, the ongoing reality of Indian raids allowed the U.S. to essentially dismember Mexico. So even though the Native Americans didn't willfully or even they didn't willfully join in this Mexican-American war, the way it turned out, they were fighting for the U.S. They were taking back their land for themselves with no thought of how this was affecting the United States, because they just wanted their land back from Mexico. And it ended up working for the U.S. to come and take all of that area from Mexico and change the border to the Rio Grande. So in the end, it's just an interesting way I think it's an interesting way to study Native American, First American involvement in these wars that happened on U.S. soil. Of course, eventually we'll get to, like we did World War I last week, where the Native Americans became fierce soldiers and warriors for the U.S. But, just going back to the Revolutionary War and inching forward, you see that the battles were to secure, to save, to hang on to with all they had, the only way of life they'd ever known. And these wars changed everything. They changed the course of history of course, it opened the door for the settlement of the United States by these descendants of the colonists and other European settlers, and changed the way of life for every Native American tribe that lived here. Every first American, the history of their people also changed forever. And so it's not like I was kind of laughing about this slide being the last one before it says happy trails. It's not really a happy story. It is a very important part of our history, though, and I think it's something that we need to really study and learn. And I don't know what to do with all of this knowledge now, except just to ponder this and to try to have a little bit of a better view and understanding of how different people groups feel about how the U.S. became the country that it is today. But like I said, you know, the way it works out, and we already know up to present day that these people groups that were affected by the colonization ended up becoming United States citizens themselves. And we're all part of this great country now. And so we kind of see that part of the story, which makes you feel a little bit better about how it all came to be. We see a brotherhood existing at the end. But tune in next week. We're going to keep going with this. There's a lot more to learn past the Mexican-American War. And watch tomorrow too. Darcy Reeves and Cindy Parks from the Chisholm Trail Arts Council are going to be here. They've got their membership drive going, and they're going to be telling us about the concert series and all the great events they have planned for this coming year. So you don't want to miss that. It's going to be a great episode. Thanks for watching today. I'll see you tomorrow. Happy trails.